Well, guys, let me share my screen here. I've called this presentation Christmas at Matthew's House. And one of the reasons I've called this is because Matthew is really unique in the story of the Gospels because he's a tax collector and he is known to host parties. And the kind of people who show up at those parties are not the kind of people that the religious folks of the first century would have hung around with. And so I imagine this is the way Matthew would tell the story of Jesus to this particular group. Go with me on this and we'll see where we go. For those of you that are serious nerds and you really want to know everything there is to know about the birth narratives of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, this is your go-to book. It is 752 pages. It is so detailed. There it is, guys. It is so detailed that any question you might have will be touched on there. Of course, I will not be able to summarize 752 pages for us today. So put on your seatbelts and let's kind of walk through this story. Let's get back to Matthew, guys. It starts off with a line that looks either like a title or a header line that says, this is the genealogy, literally Biblos Genesios, book of beginnings, book of Genesis, book of beginnings of Jesus the Messiah. Messiah is an English translation of the word Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. What's interesting to me about how this story connects us with the previous story, and by the previous story, I mean the story that we find in the Old Testament, is that this phrase, Biblios Genesios, this phrase of this is the genealogy, is repeatedly used throughout Genesis. When you read those, as you're reading Genesis, it all of a sudden says, these are the generations of, and then there's some character mentioned. And so it's very clear that from the beginning, Matthew's telling a story in the diction and language of the Old Testament. And you'll find it repeated several times. This is the story of, this is the record, this is the book of the record. And then I want us to remember the end of the book before we, since we're not going to be able to do this here, it's kind of, this is where Matthew ends. Think about this as part of the beginning. Keep the beginning and oftentimes in ancient literature, especially, the beginnings and the ends connect. Then Jesus came to them, his disciples, and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Not only does it give you a sense of who Jesus is presented to be in the Gospel of Matthew, but it shows that the larger concern and audience is all nations. And I think that's an important feature to keep in mind, is that while this is internally a very Jewish story, it's opening up in various places to other people. So keep that in mind. And then let's move into the ancestors. I have basically taken all of the extra words out, and just so we can quickly see whose story is this. Jesus's story is told in terms of Abraham and David. It is fairly clear once we get past King David that the interest is in the genealogy of the kings of Israel, or kings of Judah, to be honest, yeah. And so along the way, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and then it mentions his brothers. And I think that mention is to get us to think about all of the tribes of Israel. That's where the tribes come from. But we get these interesting comments along the way. Perez and Zerah, they're mentioned because they're twins, whose mother was Tamar. Along the way, Matthew will introduce women who are not the best of characters if you were telling the story clean. If you were telling the story kind of hygienically, you'd not really want Tamar in there. But there's possibly two connections with the women that are mentioned. One is they've got very suspicious sexual stories. I don't know if that's Matthew's connector, but the one connector that I do know is they're all foreign women. They're not Jewish originally or part of the Jewish community. And so we get the first one, Tamar, and then we get the men again, right? Boaz, Obed, And when we get down to David, David is designated king. So he's given a title in addition to his name, which kind of gives us, again, all of this links Jesus's story to the whole story. And so Matthew is starting as if he's not telling a new story, but he's telling the same story, only in the next stage of that story. The next set, oh, by the way, there's 14 names inclusive here, which means there's actually 13 generations, not 14. Because we're going to count David again in the next set. And here it gets interesting. David, Solomon, and then we get another one of the women mentioned. Can't even get her name out, it appears. Bathsheba. But the name, the one that is Uriah's wife. Now, what's interesting here is that this woman is married to a foreigner. And maybe that's why Uriah is mentioned and not Bathsheba. But again, it's interesting because it's not typical in these ancient genealogies to even mention the women at all. And then we have basically the list of kings: Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Uzziah. And then Matthew gives us a little bit of a curve. He fails to mention 3 more. And so his next name is Jotham. And so there's actually 3 names missing in this genealogy that you can find in the Old Testament. And then there's Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, Jeconiah, and his brothers. That is the group of people. These are largely Judeans who are carried into Babylonian captivity about 500, 600 years before Jesus, to the time of the exile to Babylon. You can ask me all kinds of questions about why these 3 names that were dropped. I don't know. There's lots of literature that's been written around it. I think it would have just blown up Matthew's 14. And so he's trying to keep it simple so people can keep the story together. Nobody really knows, and by the way, you get 15 names inclusive in this list. So let me back up to the last list. We get 14 there. This list, we get 15. And then after the exile to Babylon, we've got Jeconiah, Shealtiel, and Zerubbabel. And those are the only guys that you can find in the Bible because the Old Testament ends, right? And everything that's in gray are names we don't have any record outside of this. So it's a record of the genealogy of Jesus. And basically, by the way, First Chronicles does mention Zerubbabel children, but not this one. So Abiah, Eliakim, Azor, Zadok, Achim, Elihud, Eleazar, Mathan, and Jacob. We have no record of outside of Matthew. And then there's Joseph. And Joseph is identified by the woman he's connected with, the husband of Mary. You know what? I think I missed somebody else. Did I miss Rahab? No, there's Rahab. Rahab. And so the women that we have here is Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, and then Uriah's wife, and then finally we have Mary, who is called the Messiah according to the text. So we've got 14 plus Mary. And notice that the lean in here is that Mary's the mother of Jesus, not Joseph as the father of Jesus, which for obvious reasons. So, and then these 3 sets are closed out by this final commentary on the part of Matthew. Thus, there are 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah or to the Christ. And so what Matthew seems to be doing is connecting the story of Jesus to the royal family of Judah. Also linking him back to Abraham, but particularly Jesus is a legitimate heir to the throne of Israel. And when Matthew does this, I don't think when Matthew says what we have in front of us here, it's very likely that he's doing what we see often in ancient Jewish literature. He's giving quick summary for the purpose of helping people know the story. So if you're holding him to 15 names and 16 names, he would say, yeah. What he's done is he's given 3 sets that are fairly easily memorable and might have been important for the early Christians to be able to communicate with other Jews about who this Jesus was. So, fascinating names. Remember, the women are mentioned. Interesting to think about why. Most of them have foreign connections. All of them have very interesting stories around sexuality. So here's the setup.
A quick question, Stan, about the numbers 42 and 14. Are there meaning in those numbers that we might be able to take?
Matthew doesn't make anything of them. Yeah, I think once you begin to play with numbers, unless the author tells you, then you're basically importing this or that. Nobody exactly knows exactly what the numbers do. I think when you hear 3 sets of 14, I hear 2 times 7, completeness, but Matthew doesn't seem to be playing the numbers. What he's interested in is establishing the family line, which also caused a bit of a problem because we don't know anything about Mary. We don't know if she's of the tribe of Judah at this point. So in some sense, in the Matthew, in the Matthenian genealogy, Jesus is linked by adoption to the family of David. And that's as far, we'll solve the other problem when we get to Luke next week. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. What an ugly translation that is. The Greek actually says he was righteous. And since righteousness is a theme of Matthew, that's what they should have stuck with. But that's my bias today. And yet he did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. Let me deal with Jewish weddings. By the way, when we think of marriage in the Bible, we often go immediately from what we do for marriage to Jesus addressing what we do for marriage. Marriage looked very different, whether it was Greek, Roman, or Jewish. And so I've given you a couple of slides here that kind of spell out what Jewish weddings look like. Jewish marriages, I'm going to just read it for you. Jewish marriages, according to rabbinic sources, which we think holds true for the first century, show many formal similarities to Greek and Roman practices. The marriage was a contract between families. That's not how we do marriage. A marriage is if we call it a contract at all, it's between 2 people, and the families vie for which one's going to control it. But that's a whole nother story, and maybe I'm telling my story. I don't know. The marriage was a contract between families. It was affected. This is Jewish marriage in 2 stages: the betrothal, or the acquisition of the bride, and the wedding proper. And so basically we would call the betrothal stage engagement, but it was more serious than what we call engagement. The betrothal had the legal force of marriage. So they are technically legally, in practice, married. I don't know what that means about the relationship, what the kind of relationship people had between them during this stage. And it could only be broken by divorce. Notice that our text in Matthew tells us that. It was accomplished by the bridegroom paying the bride price. This is how the marriage was accomplished, and delivering a deed. The customary written contract included the husband's duties to his wife and the sum due her in the event of a divorce or death. The bridegroom moving into the father-in-law's house to live with the bride without further ceremony was also recognized but discouraged by rabbinic writings. By the way, marriage in the ancient world was simply two people consenting together without any governmental oversight. So marriage has different elements in the first century than it does today. And although this kind of moving in together and consenting is kind of discouraged by the rabbinic writings, but it was basically legal across the Roman Empire. 2 people deciding that they wanted to be married could be married without further documentation or otherwise. Anyway, the wedding ceremony was held under a canopy. The bride was prepared by bathing, anointing, and clothing with special adornments. She was then escorted from her father's house to the accompaniment of song, dance, musical instruments, and sent usually in the evening torchlight. The essential elements of the wedding was the introduction of the bride into the groom's house, where the tent, the huppah, was set up. 7 blessings were pronounced on the couple, and the marriage contract was read, followed by 7 days of festivities. And so this would have been kind of the typical Jewish pattern of getting married. So Joseph and Mary are in this first stage. Let me back up to the text that we just read a few moments ago. Joseph is caught off guard because his wife, whom he's not had relationships with, is pregnant. He's thinking what most people would think. However, according to the law, he could have exposed her and maybe even led to her stoning. There's legislation in the Old Testament for doing this. And Joseph's righteousness comes out that while he thinks he's been wronged and he wants the divorce, he does not want to shame his wife. And so this is Matthew's first example of righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew is the first case example of what the kind of righteousness Jesus will be about looks like. But after he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, notice son of David, underscoring the connection with the kingship line. Do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you will call his name Jesus. Jesus in the Hebrew, Jesus, because he will, and listen to the rationale, call him Jesus, which means Yahweh saves, the Lord saves, because he will save his people from their sins. In this context, this would be the Jewish people, his people. And so at the beginning, you've got this beginning narrow focus, but remember, the end of the book is to all the Gentile nations, right? So keep that in there. Let's keep our story moving a bit, where it begins to get rather interesting. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means, Matthew's kind of added this to it for interpretation purposes, which means God is with us. And here's where I want to slow us down a little bit, because this is the beginning of Matthew attempting to hook the story of Jesus to the story of Israel. The word fulfill for us often is taken to be there was a prophecy made, and then later in time there was a single fulfillment. So it's kind of a prediction thing. That is not what Matthew's doing if you begin to look at all of the text that Matthew. For Matthew, the word fulfill means to make completed. So Jesus doesn't fulfill predictions. He is the completion of the story of Israel. For example, if you go back and read Isaiah 7:14, you will find out that a baby had to be born in the time of Isaiah that had immediate application. You see, in Isaiah, before this child is able to be weaned, the kings with which Ahaz is having trouble with will be conquered. And so very often, fulfillment means it happened, something like it happened in the Old Testament, and then something like it is in the story of Jesus. Now, let me give you one other interesting problem, and you guys can shoot me for it. But if you read this text in Hebrew, the word for virgin is Alma, A-L-M-A-H, and it means young woman. But when it was translated into the Septuagint Greek, when it was translated into Greek, the word they chose to translate Alma is Parthenos, which is the particular word for virgin. Matthew is quoting his text from the Greek text. If you read the Hebrew text, it would be legitimate to translate the word young woman. I know, all kinds of interesting wrinkles here. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad Jana. Everybody, make sure you can see Jana because she's expressing the full consternation of what's going on here. And so I'd like to suggest to you that if you read Isaiah's context, you're going to need a baby back there in order to make his text work. And so Matthew reaches in and pulls a text out that he wants to apply to Jesus. And so if you read the text as if Isaiah prophesied that one day there will be a virgin and only one fulfillment of this prophecy, you're going to have a struggle with what's actually in Isaiah. However, if fulfillment means that Jesus is the culmination of Israel's story, then what you're going to see is kind of a repetition of the story of ancient Israel in the story of Jesus. It's going to get easier, Jana. There's a verse that's going to make it much easier a little bit later. This one's always controversial because it's become a litmus test for how you understand orthodoxy, right? Jesus was really born of a virgin. That's what's at stake here. But not for Matthew. For Matthew, Jesus continues the story of Israel. Kind of hang on to that one. And let's do this. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to the son, and he gave him the name Jesus. Notice that they didn't give him the name Emmanuel. That's because Emmanuel actually belongs to the Isaiah prophecy. Yeah, Jana, thank you. Keep doing that. You're helping us. And so I'm going to move into the next part of the story just to keep us moving. And it's the tale, I've called it the tale of two kings because it's really about the interaction between Herod the Great, for the most part, and the birth of Jesus. But before I do that, let me scare you just a little bit by saying, here is the genealogical table of Herod. Yeah, if you're using your phone, I am so sorry. I don't know if I can. If I enlarge this, does it enlarge for you guys? Okay. Herod the Great's right here. We're not gonna deconstruct this table, but anywhere there's a crown, it's kingship. And virtually, there's Archelaus. We're going to mention him. There's Herod Agrippa, Herod Antipas. There's Herod Phillips that's mentioned. Here's Agrippa, Herod Agrippa the first, Herod Agrippa the second. I just want to tell you, we know more about Herod than almost any ancient character because Josephus told us more than we ever wanted to know. And that's why we can reconstruct this genealogical table. So Herod's kind of a big deal. By the way, Herod marries, by the way, his second wife belongs to the Jewish community, Mariamne, or third wife. He's got a couple here named Mariamne. And she is a descendant of the Maccabees. And so that's how Herod gets married into the Jewish family. He's not actually Jewish. He's Idumean, which is a neighbor group to the Israelites, the ancient Israelites. Well, anyway, there's more than you want to know, but that's the story we're going to start with. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." Matthew doesn't tell us what his background is. My guess is that these folks are ancient. These folks are connected to the Babylonians or the Persians who got to know the Jews when they were in exile. That's kind of the background for where these people come from and why they're looking for Jesus. But one of the critical features, I think, is that these are foreigners. These are outsiders coming to worship Jesus. By the way, if you'll go back and read Numbers 24:17, you will find a prediction in the pagan prophet, the non-Jewish prophet Balaam, about a star rising and kingship. And so it's got an interesting connection to the story of Balaam and the donkey. Well, maybe not the donkey just yet, but when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Obviously, Herod's disturbed because there's another king in town. At least that's what he's worried about. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea. By the way, you need to remember David was born in Bethlehem. And so the expectation that somebody would come from Bethlehem, pretty reasonable because of the tribe of Judah. Bethlehem and Judah, they replied, for it is written, this is what the prophet has written. And then in a modified form of Micah 5:2, you have this quote, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Increasingly, in the latter part of the Old Testament, there is the increasing expectation that somebody like David, somebody's from David's line, will rise and be this Messiah king that will make all things right, either take the people back to Jerusalem, make Israel great again. By the time you get to the first century, the expectation is that this Messiah would be able to deal with the Romans. And so it's all in terms of an earthly kingship. So where's the Messiah coming from? Well, we've got this one text in Micah that's going to function as an oracle now. He comes from Bethlehem. Very good. Let me keep us reading the story. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. No, that's not what's up. You can read right through this text. Thank you, Jana. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, notice that most of our nativity scenes get this one a little bit wrong. We don't have magi and shepherds at the same time. We'll deal with Luke next week. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. And notice that we've got the beginning of the missing Joseph. We think Joseph died early. We don't know. And they bowed down and worshiped him. They actually really did worship him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And what's interesting about these gifts, guys, is that they don't really land anywhere. You can't find any of them, and you can find them separately in the Old Testament. But what seems to be playing out here is the promise that the nations will come to Israel and give honor to Israel's God. And the wealth of the nations will come to Judah. Maybe. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up and take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. By the way, do you hear the echo of the Moses story and the killing of the children? And so all kinds of Old Testament echoes are, more than I've been able to point out in our short time together today. So he took the child. He got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. By the way, this is the best text to try to figure out how Matthew is playing with the word fulfill. If you go back and read Hosea 11:1, you will find out that the son there is the nation of Israel. It's not promising a single person. It is out of Egypt. It's a comment on the Exodus. By the way, if you doubt me, go to Hosea 11:1 and read the text. There's nothing really messianic about Hosea 11:1. But Matthew is applying this text to Jesus. How can he do that? Because Jesus is the fulfillment of the story of Israel. Once you get into that vein, all the other texts begin to make sense. Jesus not only completes the story of Israel, but as we get to the temptation story, which we won't get to, he actually pulls off the story Israel was called to do. He is faithful when tested. But this is, I think, the best place to get a sense, because the other texts tend to be loaded texts. That is, we've got theological things that we need out of those texts. This text is one that starts out in Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son. And if you read the rest of the text, it's very clearly the nation of Israel he's talking about. And this is not unusual for the way that a text might be interpreted in the first century among the Jews about other things. So it's just not the way we tend to use the word fulfill. Okay, just entertain some nerdy thoughts with me just for a moment. Before Jesus came, this text could have never been applied to Jesus. Nobody would even think of doing it. But once Jesus is accepted as the center of the story, then one can go back and read the Old Testament with multiple texts now applying to Jesus. Nobody would have made the connection between the sacrifice of Isaac and the coming Messiah until Jesus came. Which means that these texts take on new meaning because of Jesus. Yeah, Jana, thank you for the support. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time they had learned from the Magi. So it's possible that these Magi visit Jesus up to the age of 2. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. The original context of this text is that the children of Israel are being exported from Judah to Babylon, and mothers are crying over the children that have been killed by the conquering of the Babylonians. That's original context. But Matthew is now using it to speak specifically to the slaughter of the infants. Thus, most of these texts have an immediate application. Most of these ancient Old Testament texts have an immediate application, and then it gets a new reading in the story of Jesus. It might be significant to know that Rachel is actually buried in Bethlehem. Go back to the Genesis, I think it's Genesis 36 or something, but the end of Rachel's story, you'll find that she's buried in Ephrathah, which is another name for ancient Israel, or for ancient Bethlehem. And so you can see easily this text applies in both settings. It's basically a prophetic lament of the children who are dying as the people are being transported to Babylon, but it also fits our story here. It's bothered the more historical-like people that this story of Herod's massacre doesn't show up in any of the secular literature about Herod. But when you read the Herod story in Josephus, you'll find this is completely consistent with the Herod we know. And Bethlehem's a small place, and scholars have tried to struggle. How many people are put to death? Could be a small group of about 15. Nobody knows for sure. But I want to remind us that when we tell the Christmas story, we don't often tell this part of the Christmas story. And Matthew thought it was important to tell this part of the Christmas story. And I think it's because Jesus's incarnation is not an escape, it's an entrance into our reality. And our reality looks like this. Also, the linkage to the story of Exodus is amazing, because the leaders in Exodus were trying to manage the population of the Israelites. So what I want you to see, and I don't want you to hear me saying that the Jesus story didn't happen the way that Matthew says it did, but Matthew is working to connect his story with the story of ancient Israel. And so he's pulling forth these fulfillment texts. We've actually got one more, so we'll do it. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph. Notice how many times that showed up in a dream, and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead. And he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. Notice land of Israel puts it in the big context of the story of Israel. And when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Galilee, by the way, would have been where the northern tribes were, the northern tribes of Israel that disappear under the Assyrians in 722. So Jesus is now living in northern Israel as opposed to the land of Judah, which is south around Jerusalem. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, notice the plural, that he would be called a Nazarene. There is not a single text in the Old Testament that actually says he will be a Nazarene. And so the question comes, is he called a Nazarene because he's from Nazareth? Is he called a Nazarene because he's keeping a Nazarite vow? You remember that vow that people could take and be committed to, often for a limited amount of time? Although John the Baptist would be more likely the one under that, because he didn't eat or drink things, and Jesus did eat and drink, so it doesn't quite work. There might even be one more connection. There is the promise that Jesus will be the branch of Jesse, the branch of David. The word for branch in Hebrew is netzer. And it might be Matthew's way of reading that text from Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 11 where you'll find that language of netzer, the branch, the Nazarene. Now, Matthew's giving us an out here. We can let him free, because he says it's kind of through the prophets, and he doesn't say which one. And so it's Matthew's way of reading all of the prophets together that Jesus will be this Nazarene. But there is no text. You're not going to find a text in the Old Testament that says, oh, by the way, make sure Jesus is called the Nazarene. For Matthew, it's simply another indicator that Jesus is part of the story of Israel.